Hi, we continue in Luke 19 today as Jesus finally gets close enough to Jerusalem to see it and immediately weeps over it, as you can see on the left side of the screen at the top. So as we reach the end of the travel narrative, or maybe we've already reached it, as I talked about last time, some scholars ended after verse 27, after the little parable, some after the story about the colt and the entry, some after this scene, and some after the one that follows, clearing out the temple. But regardless of where we ended and where we have the bridge that leads up to the Passion, Jesus is about to enter into Jerusalem. Notice he's not there yet. He's near and saw the city. As I noted last time, Luke really slows down this movement from Jericho to Jerusalem, which you can see the map of here to show the various approaches to the immediate cities, to Jericho and then to Bethany and Bethphage and then to Jerusalem before he actually enters into it. So we're reaching the very end, and it's tragic, as we've been expecting all along, as Jesus warned at the very center of the travel narrative that we'll come back to too, his lament over Jerusalem. Now he weeps over it. So to enter in our passage, I want to note, as we've been looking at through this entire unit from 1711 forward here to 1948, the theme of preparing the disciples for Jesus and themselves to be rejected. And in every scene except one, this little brief 2 verses about the reign of God as entos, we've seen the expression of rejection. So here in our scene, it's that Jerusalem does not know the kairos, the special time, the quality of time in kairos of its visitation. So that's the context of what we've seen. And we've been following the link between the chiastic partners that frame the larger chiasm, and both this story and the warning that preceded it are parallel to what we saw at the very beginning of the Samaritans refusing to welcome as he approached Jerusalem. And the reason the Samaritans refused to welcome is not because they were just inhospitable, but because he was headed for Jerusalem, raising the historical antipathy between Jerusalem and Samaria all the way back before the exile, but especially in the post-exilic period about who was allowed to be in and who was not. So we'll see that here as well. And of course, it's symbolic because throughout this travel narrative, we've seen Jesus rejected for having table fellowship and other associations with tax collectors and sinners, those who the Pharisees and others believe one should not have commerce with. So as we've been also looking at in our various scenes, there are many ways in which Luke is showing that what is happening to Jerusalem in his time is not any different, or at least not materially different, from what people like Jeremiah and Ezekiel prophesied about the time of their own time, when the leaders had collaborated for their own purposes, their own selfishness with foreigners, to not care for God's people, to be bad shepherds, as Ezekiel calls them. And so we see many Hebrew scriptures in the background that connect that. We also see in our brief passage the continuation of what we've seen throughout this section, especially in chapter 19, of Luke using unique words, or almost unique words. So we have several of those here. We have 2 intratextual links here, the things that make for peace, back to 1432, and we'll look at that in a minute, and the connection between not knowing and hidden from your eyes, back to the disciples not understanding the passion portent in 1834. And then we have 4 rare or unique words. The word for ramparts here, karax, only here in the New Testament. The word for surround, only here. The word for on every side, only 2 other places. And the word for they will crush, only here. So Luke using language that is fitting in these cases for military siege. And so we see a number of Hebrew scriptures in the background. As we'll note, this passage from Isaiah, one scholar who wrote an excellent article in our scene here notes this in what he calls a dialectical relationship. In other words, what we see in Isaiah 52:6-10, expressing a return to Jerusalem from exile, is all positive about how beautiful upon the mountains are the feet of the messenger who announces peace, who brings good news, who announces salvation, who says to Zion, your God reigns. But as we see, when Jesus comes to bring that very message, he is completely rejected. And we also see here, and I've highlighted some of these to make the connections, the specific language or imagery we see in our short passage, that Jeremiah weeping over the city for its fate, just as Jesus weeps. Isaiah anticipating that Yahweh will besiege Jerusalem with towers and rage siege works, which is what we hear with the ramparts and the surrounding in our text. Similarly in Ezekiel about the city Jerusalem and putting siege works against it. And then also in Hosea about when mothers are dashed in pieces with their children, much like crushed to the ground with your children here. So Luke is basically trying to have Jesus say, you should not be surprised that this is happening. It's much like what we've seen since his Luke 4 and his proclamation of Jubilee from Isaiah 61 back in Nazareth at the time. And the story, not from Isaiah 61, but from Leviticus, highlights that if you don't practice Jubilee, you will see the bad consequences around you, and they will get worse and worse and worse until you wake up and practice my ways, says Yahweh. And if you don't, you'll be crushed and end up in exile, doing horrible things, eating your children, etc., because of your desperation and the famine and the horror of not living in harmony with the way of the Creator. And so we're seeing a very similar thing here, this lament and tears over the fact that they just refuse to listen. And one might make the same case about many Christian leaders today, but I'm not here to preach. I'm here to just open up the text, so you can do that yourself. I also want to note in these 4 verses, we don't see Jerusalem mentioned. Instead, we see the phrase, the city, as he came near and saw the city. So let's look at both aspects of that, Jerusalem and the city. So here's where we've seen Jerusalem throughout, and you can see I've color-coded them into journey markers, just places where they're heading toward Jerusalem, and it's just being talked about. Blue, where Jerusalem is the holy city, and almost all of those are in the beginning, as we see here, and except for these down here at the end. And then the green ones where there's criticism of Jerusalem, we saw here those coming from Jerusalem to Jesus, and then we also saw the criticism here, and then of course at the center the chiasm, and then we're on our situation approaching here, and we'll see it several times in our immediate section. So Jerusalem is mentioned a number of times, but notice in our immediate passage, last time was 1928, and the next time will be 2120. So here we are in 1941 to 44, and Jerusalem isn't going to be mentioned out loud for 2 more chapters. Instead, what we hear often is just the generic, the city. And these are links of where the text actually says the city, ha-palos here, not just using the word palos for city, but referring to the city, not just a city or some city. And I highlighted these by 3 colors here. The blue are the named cities. Both of these are plainly Bethlehem here, and this one is obviously Jerusalem. Here are unnamed cities, so just a woman in the city and a man of the city, and they're male-female pairs in an interesting way that Jesus heals them both and provides salvation to both of them. And this is all the same city in Gerasa. And then, interestingly, we get to our passage here, and notice as I was noting previously about when Jerusalem is mentioned, in this whole unit, Jerusalem isn't mentioned, but it's only referred to simply as the city. And that leads me to ask, and I haven't seen other scholars ask this about this immediate passage, but it leads me to ask the question that I've worked on in a number of my writings and other elements within this Radical Bible, especially in Genesis, whether Luke is making a broader critique not just of Jerusalem, but of the city in general. Or as we hear it in Revelation, the holy city versus the great city. The holy city being New Jerusalem, it was supposed to be earthly Jerusalem, and the great city being empire, the expression of empire, whether that's Rome or whatever, which goes back to Genesis 10 and the first reference to the great city. So Luke doesn't use the phrase the great city, but I'm just wondering out loud here, given these situations, that the woman of the city was a sinner in the city, but when she comes to Jesus, she's forgiven, and the man of the city who had demons in him comes out healed as a result of that. So there could just well be something that's the exact opposite of the Roman world, which is to say, the very concept of civilization means life in cities, from the Latin civil. So Luke's critique, although he doesn't call people back to Genesis in the sense of living directly on the earth and simply eating the food that God provides directly from the earth, he's not going to be that radical about it, but perhaps he's also suggesting that cities in his context always represent what I would call the religion of empire, or in his world, a way that's in contrast to the gospel. So we'll listen to that as we go. So let's put our brief passage up here, and we'll look at our short passage here. So as he came near, and I was noting Engizo here 18 times in Luke, and we just saw it 3 times in our previous section as part of the approaching element, and saw the city, he wept over it. And we've seen weeping before. Interestingly, we didn't see weeping in the lament at the center. He said he lamented over it, but we've seen weeping a number of times, including, as we'll see it in 23:28, where Jesus on the way to the cross says, "Weep not over me, but for yourselves and your children." And there are a number of examples of weeping as a prophetic sign. I put Jeremiah 9 on our page here. And as he's weeping over it, saying, even though he's talking to Jerusalem from a distance, plainly Jerusalem as a city isn't listening, and it can't exactly hear him from a distance. So this is for the disciples, not for Jerusalem. But it can be heard by Jerusalem through our text here. As my note below has, Jesus' lament calls on numerous Septuagint words and images, and I highlighted some of those here. Furta is the author who reads it dialectically against this passage here, as an expression of what could have been rather than what is. So we hear, if you, even you, and this is in the middle of the clause for emphasis. So really the text says, if you had known the things for peace, even you, as if, there's some expression that even Jerusalem would find it difficult. Here the word is for know, and as I noted up here, the knowing and hidden goes back to the disciples not knowing and having Jesus' word about what's going to be happening, and i.e. his rejection being hidden. So the disciples are in the same situation as Jerusalem. It'll be no surprise when Jesus goes to the cross, they almost all run away. So on this day, as Green notes, it's plain the day of Jesus' arrival, and yet the days will come, which explicitly here, not quite explicitly, but as explicitly as it can be, refers to the Roman destruction of Jerusalem, which for Luke is already in the past. I can note here that Mark, for whom it's not in the past, speaks of it in mysterious Daniel-like tones here about the desolating sacrilege. Let the reader understand, because it's too hot to handle at that point. But by this time, after 70, Luke can make it very clear exactly what's going on. And we'll see that again in chapter 21 in the apocalyptic imagery of the destruction of Jerusalem, where Luke makes it much more explicit than Mark does. So your situation, Jerusalem, is the same as the disciples, but here's another interesting link that connects us elsewhere. The things that make for peace, ta pros erene, which is exactly the same language as 1432, although it's not translated the same in any situation I know. Let's go back to that here. This is about the king who is preparing for war but doesn't have enough troops, and we're told if he cannot defeat his enemy, while the other is still far away, he sends a delegation, a presbya, just like in the parable of the nobleman that we saw, and ask for the things that make for peace. Here it says the terms of peace, but it's the exact same phrase. So in that context, an imperial actor recognizing what's coming would seek peace. But Jerusalem, as the things that make for peace are hidden from their eyes. They don't even realize what they're facing. And peace, erene here, shalom in Hebrew, of course, and we see it throughout Luke here in, again, 3 different ways. World peace, like in our immediate situation. Interpersonal peace, peace between people and peace between houses. And imperial peace, the peace that comes from being fully armed, or in the war situation I was just referring to. So notice this reference in 1432 is only one away from what we have in 1941 to 42 in terms of the use of the Greek erene in Luke. So if it's not immediately there, it's 5 chapters earlier, but if we're paying attention, we should be able to hear that in the background. And really, that is one of the questions of the entire gospel. What are the things that make for peace? Are they a hierarchical empire with weapons and things like that, which is what the Israelites wanted back in 1 Samuel 8. We want to have a king so we can be like the other nations and have military security that's established by a king and an army? Or is it what Jesus has been showing, practicing Jubilee and everybody meeting on the level place and forgiving sins and learning how to get along with each other and with the earth? Those are the choices between the way of Jesus and the way of empire. But Jerusalem can't see it. So back to our passage. So indeed the days will come, and as Green notes, 5 images of military conquest and destruction in these 2 verses. And he notes below what I've been saying, that this is reminiscent of the destruction of Jerusalem in the exile 6 centuries earlier. The days will come upon you, which are always in the past for Luke, but in the future for Jesus. It will come upon you when your enemies, who we last heard of in 1927, when the nobleman, who, as I noted in the interpretation of the parable, has been hideously likened to Jesus by many commentators until recently, when we can see he's more like Herod Archelaus, and Jesus is more like the resistor who hides the money in the cloth and then has it taken away from him. But in any event, Jesus is about love of enemies, but Jerusalem isn't, and your enemies will set up ramparts around you. literally like stakes used to fence a vineyard, but harax here, only here in the New Testament, and it's 15 times in the Septuagint as a standard language of preparing to besiege a city. And the besieging of a city is a horrific military reality, and I just want to highlight that for a moment. We tend to focus on the horribleness of crucifixion, which is indeed horrible almost beyond imagination. But a siege means starving people to death. It means shutting off the city and having them starve until they either give up or come out in desperation and fight to their death. Used with great irony many times by the Christian church in the Crusades against the quote-unquote infidels, whether those were Muslims or so-called heretical Christians. So it continued to be a pattern despite the fact that Jesus is plainly saying this is a function of people who don't know the things that make for God's peace. So ramparts here only here in the New Testament, and the word for surround, as I noted, also only here in the New Testament, and hem you in on every side. As Speckman notes, means they will be held in custody. They are completely surrounded, and they're basically prisoners of war until they either die or surrender. And again, the word pentathen for on every side is only here in the Gospels, except for one example in Mark. And then finally, he reaches the conclusion of it here with a number of Hebrew Scripture passages. Again, I didn't put all those in here, but I do want to go to my note below to highlight what Kinman says. It is Luke alone among the evangelists who makes explicit the connection between the entry and God's judgment on the city. Because as we see in the Mark 11 reference that he makes, that when Jesus enters the city on a reconnaissance mission, which we don't see in Luke, he finds a fig tree without figs and he curses it. And when they leave the city, it's withered, and then he explains symbolically what that's about. And as Ched Myers and many other scholars have noted, it's a symbolic judgment on the lack of fruitfulness of Jerusalem and its leadership. But Luke leaves out the symbolic story of Jerusalem's impending destruction. Instead, puts in this much more explicit element. All he left out is the word Romans for people to understand exactly what's going on. And he describes it in horrible terms. Again, the kind of horrible we hear in Leviticus 26 for not practicing Jubilee. They will crush you to the ground. Another word that's only here in the New Testament, as we see there, echoed into a number of Hebrew Scripture passages. I didn't put them all up here. You and your children within you. And my note has, in context, it means inhabitants, which is certainly can be right. The children of a city are not just the young people, but all the people of the city. I note also, if it didn't say within you, could mean like what we would call suburbs, daughter cities. The cities are related to a mother city, so to speak. But this is within you, so it doesn't have that reference here. But ironically echoes 18:15 to 17 of make yourself like children if you want to receive the kingdom. But they're unable to risk being vulnerable, and their children end up being crushed. And they will not leave within you one stone upon another. Echoing from the Septuagint, another passage from the Absalom rebellion issue there. And Harold and Coat ask, is this how the stones will cry out that we heard Jesus say in response to the Pharisees' attempt to silence Jesus' multitude of disciples? But I would note that the not stone upon another is relating much more to what we'll see in Luke 21:6 here about the destruction of Jerusalem rather than the raising up of voices from the stones. And the reason is because you did not know the kairos of your visitation from God. And I would note that in this form, 42 to 44, form a little ABA chiasm. You don't know the things that make for peace, and you don't know the time of your visitation from God, which are basically two ways of saying the same thing. So instead, you're going to be surrounded and crushed. Visitation here, episkopos, can also mean oversight, but of course it's echoing back to the hopes that we saw right back in the beginning with Zechariah there, and that we also heard in chapter 7. But mostly these at the beginning. The prayer that the birth of Jesus would mean that God's visitation had happened and peace would break out. But because he's being rejected, that's not what's going to happen. So he has one more thing to do before he starts to be confronted by the leaders in Jerusalem, and that's to go into the temple and drive out those who are selling. And we'll look at that story in our next video. See you then for that. Bye-bye.